Welcome to the podcast, The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry, a consultant, a coach, and a serial entrepreneur. The mission here is to teach, inspire, and to motivate. You are one of the most educated, most credentialed, most economically powerful groups of people in the history of this country. You sit on boards, you run hospitals, you manage multi-billion-dollar portfolios, you lead universities, law firms, and government agencies. And every 4 years, without negotiation, without condition, without a single measurable return on investment demanded in advance, you've handed your vote to someone who already knows you nowhere else to go. That's not loyalty. That is leverage that has never been used. Today's conversation on this podcast, I want to change things a little bit. My name is Keith Terry, and welcome to The Next Big Thing. Before we go any further, let me tell you what this episode is and is not. This is not a political episode. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I'm not going to tell you to leave your party and go to another. I'm not going to tell you to go and do a scorecard against one side or the other. What this is a power episode. And the question that this episode is asking, when was the last time you negotiated the terms of your political participation the same way you negotiate everything else in your professional life? You negotiate your compensation, you negotiate your board seat, you negotiate your consulting contract. You don't walk into those rooms simply donating your value. You name what you bring and you name what you expect in return. I'll say it again. You name what you bring and you name what you expect in return. But at the ballot box, the discipline disappears. And for the Black professional class specifically, the gap between economic sophistication and political behavior has become the most expensive miscalculation of our generation. I'm coming to this conversation from inside the system. I've sat at executive tables. I've served on boards. I've operated on the C-suite for more than 25 years across healthcare and nonprofit sectors. I've watched what happens when power is deployed with precision, and I've watched what happens when it is squandered. What I want to name today is something most people in my position are unwilling to say in public, but the data says it. The history says it. And if you're honest with yourself, your own experience says it as well. And that is this, that the Black professional class is the most politically sophisticated voting bloc in this country when it comes to showing up, and amongst the least politically sophisticated when it comes to demanding something in return. That is the conversation we're going to have today. So let's get into it. Let me start with the data, the landscape. Why am I saying this? Let's start with the Black community, and specifically the Black professional middle class actually delivers at the ballot box, what they actually deliver at the ballot box. According to Pew Research analysis, 2020 and 2024 presidential election, 92% of Black non-Hispanic voters vote Democratic. That is not a voting bloc. That is a captive audience. And it is consistent across 3 election cycles. Pew found that 27% of eligible Black voters cast a ballot in every single race. That's higher consistent participation than any other group. Let's look at what this consistent, reliable participation has returned to them. Just going to give a couple of data points. The Federal Reserve Board Consumer Finance Survey of 2022 found that the wealth gap of a median Black household is $45,000 compared to $285,000 for a typical white family. National Association of Realtors report of March of 2025 showed that the gap between Black ownership and white ownership was 28%. That's wider than 27% gap that existed when the Fair Housing Act was signed into law in 1968. 57 years later, we've lost ground. Now, the next point, the Alliance for Board Diversity and Deloitte's Missing Pieces report found that Black representation on the Fortune 500 boards grew 11.9% in 2022. Deloitte's own national managing partner said at the current pace, boards will not represent the country's population until 2060. And given what's happening now coming out of Washington, I would suspect that we're rolling back. In the federal contracting market, now check this out. In the federal contracting market, awarded $637 billion in a single year. Now, guess how much went to Black small business? $9.5 billion. Out of $637 billion, only $9.5 billion went to small Black businesses. That's less than 0.5%. Both parties have governed this country for the last 30 years. Both parties have received the benefit of Black political participation. These numbers belong to both of them. This is the gap. Now let's get into why it exists. Let me make this personal for a moment. Over the last 25 years, I've sat in boardrooms, executive leadership meetings, non-for-profit organizations, and educational institutions. I've watched people negotiate compensation packages worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've watched executives negotiate equity positions. I've seen them negotiate down to the smallest detail. I've watched board members negotiate all kinds of things. The people who get the best outcomes, they almost never walk into those conversations saying, oh, take whatever you think is fair. They show up knowing exactly what they want, then they go negotiate it. Yet I've watched many of those same highly accomplished professionals become remarkably passive when the conversation shifts to politics. I'll say that again. I've watched many of the same highly accomplished professionals become remarkably passive when the conversation shifts to politics. The discipline disappears, the conditions disappear, the negotiations disappear. That contradiction stayed with me. But if negotiation is the tool that creates results everywhere else in our professional lives, why would we abandon it in one of the most consequential decisions we make as citizens? Now, here is where I'm going to say something that a lot of people in my position won't say out loud. The uncomfortable truth in this conversation is not that politicians failed the Black community. That's been documented. That's real. And it has been true long enough that you should know that it's not a surprise to anyone. The uncomfortable truth is this: the Black professional class specifically has not yet deployed the full weight of its economic and institutional power in alignment with its political behavior. I'm not talking about the Black working class, which is under a different structural pressure and operating with fewer degrees of freedom. I'm talking about the professional class. I'm talking about people with advanced degrees, investment portfolios, board seats, procurement authorities, payroll, alumni networks. Those are the people I'm talking to. This class has the options that they have not yet exercised. The Black professional class controls significant economic output in this country, fills the pews of the most politically active congregation in America. It runs hospital systems, you've heard it, law firms, investment firms, university departments, PAC organizations. It writes checks. And it does all of that while maintaining a political posture that is almost entirely reactive, almost entirely partisan, and almost entirely without condition. Activity is showing up. Power is naming your terms before you show up. Let me say that again. Activity is showing up, but power is naming your terms before you show up. What the civil rights movement actually built, the tradition we come from, understood something that the current professional class has largely abandoned. The Black church built the infrastructure of the civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in 1957 by Dr. Martin Luther King as its first president, did not operate as a partisan endorsement machine. Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960, trained organizers in civic leverage, not political loyalty. The NAACP, founded in 1909, built legal and political pressure campaigns that outlasted administrations of both parties. These institutions didn't endorse candidates. and trust that government would follow. They developed leaders, organized constituents, built institutional coalitions, and held power accountable from the outside. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were not gifts from an administration. They were the result of sustained, organized, unconditional pressure applied from outside the political system. That tradition was traded gradually, then completely. The institutional infrastructure of Black civic power was converted from an accountability mechanism into a political mobilization apparatus. The church stopped holding power accountable and started turning out voters for it. The professional class stopped building leverage and started building proximity. Proximity to power is not the same thing as power. It is often the most expensive substitute for it. Scripture that speaks to this moment, Proverbs 29, verse 2. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. Notice what the verse does not say. It does not say endorse the righteous candidate and wait. It doesn't say show up every 4 years and trust the process. It says when the righteous are in authority, the implication is not passive. People of faith have a responsibility for who is in authority, and what conditions they hold those in authority to. Jeremiah 27, which is one of my favorites, says, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you will prosper too. That is not a verse about spiritual separation from civic life. This is not a verse about spiritual separation from civic life. This is a verse about deep strategic conditions, attached engagement with the system that governs your community. The believer is not called to be a spectator in civic life. The professional who claims a faith tradition rooted in justice is not released from responsibility to deploy their institutional power in the service of that justice. The question this moment is asking to the Black professional class is not which party deserves your vote. Why have you been donating what should be the most negotiated transaction in your professional life? Negotiated your pay compensation. You named that number. You named the equity. You named the benefits. You negotiated your seat on the board, the committee you wanted to serve. You even negotiated your consulting contract, the scope, the deliverables, and the fee. So here's the question. When was the last time you negotiated your vote? Not your party, your vote. What specific, measurable, time-bound commitment did the person asking for your vote make to you, to the institution you helped to lead, to the issues that the data we just talked about? If you can't answer that question with specificity, you did not negotiate, you donated. And the donation is not strategy. The donation is sentiment. Let me give you what the actual mechanics should be, because this is not theoretical. This is infrastructure. The first lever is the primary election. The primary election is where Black professional class has the most concentrated power and uses it the least. The state house primary is in most states can be divided by, let me just tell you why. The state house primary in most states can be decided by a few thousand votes. A state Senate primary can be decided by 10 to 20,000. Those are elections where incumbents are most vulnerable, where the ideological direction of the party is least set. A spotlight analysis came out in November of 2024 and found that in competitive races like Pennsylvania, the House race, as an example, the average campaign spent approximately $1.1 million. The Senate race, the average was $3.5 million. However, in many states outside major metro areas, a viable state house primary campaign can be deducted for roughly $50,000 to $150,000. Combined professional networks of medium-sized Black alumni associations a Black Chamber of Commerce chapter, and 2 or 3 corporate diversity networks can fund that race. Not support it, fund it. Second level is the local and school board level. Every major national political figure in this country came from somewhere. Barack Obama served in the Illinois State Senate. Kamala Harris served in the San Francisco DA's office. Stacey Abrams served in the Georgia House of Representatives. And at one point, I was on the Evanston-Skokie School Board. My point being this: the pipeline to national leadership runs through local offices, and local office is the most accessible entry point of any organized constituency group in this country. Third lever is the conditions of your endorsement. Before the professional class commits its network, its funds, its organizational reach, or its credibility to any candidate, it should name what it wants in return. Specific legislation, specific appointments, specific budget allocations, and with the understanding that failure to deliver will produce a primary challenge. This is not radical. This is how every other organized political constituency with resources operate. AIPAC does it. The Chamber of Commerce does it. The National Rifle Association does it. We know Teachers Union do it. So the Black professional class has the capital, the credibility, the network, and the institutional access to do the exact same thing. It has not been done because somewhere in the transition from movement politics to proximity politics, the operating assumption became that showing up loyally was sufficient. This is not about voting differently. This is about demanding differently, and demanding with the full weight of what this class actually controls. So here's my call to action. Here is my one request, my one suggestion to you. In the next 48 hours, I want you to identify one race where you live, a state legislator, a local level in your district, just one primary, where a primary election is scheduled in the next 12 months. Look up who's running. Look up their record on specific issues that are important to you. Look up wealth creation, home ownership access, health equity, small business contracting. If there is no challenger yet, ask yourself, do you know someone who should run? Do you want to run? And do you have the network and the resources to make that challenge viable? You don't have to run for office. You don't have to write a check. You have to identify leverage points, because leverage only works when incumbents know it's coming. And it only comes when organized people with resources make it come. You can find additional resources and frameworks on my website at keithdterry.com. Conversation continues there. Lead with purpose, live a balanced life, and keep chasing your next big thing. Thanks for listening to The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and a review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on my YouTube channel at Keith D. Terry. If you want to recommend a guest, please email me at info@terryperformancegroup.com. This has been produced by your host and Jade Productions.